Good morning. Today we'll be examining a paper on the default effects and follow-on behaviour with evidence from an electricity pricing programme. We will also be focusing on the theoretical background, the methodology, results, and main takeaways from the paper. What we mean by a default effect is the tendency for the vast majority of people to accept the default in an interaction. Most often, this is seen when the action required to avoid the default is virtually effortless and increases with each step that is required to avoid the default. The paper examines the evidence from a study conducted on an electricity pricing program. So why should we care about default effects and why are they useful to study? Well, decision makers are predisposed to accept the default option when confronted with a choice. This phenomenon has been examined by psychologists as well as economists and is important as it provides a relatively easy way to influence choices. This is reinforced by the content we studied in class on the default heuristic, where if there is a default, do nothing about it. Fowley et al. Identified that not only the default effect, but also the follow-on behaviour of the decision makers must be analysed as the behaviour is affected by the initial choice. This broader look at economic implications of default effects has generally been harder to detect and is the core of this study. The study of follow-on behaviour is important as default options act as anchors for our decision-making process. There are also implications for business, where customers are not always better under the new pricing program. The default effect may exist in part due to high switching costs or other factors. Alternatively, uninformed customers may be encouraged to learn the new information given to them and construct their preferences. This is the psychologist's view of default heuristics, as they argue that preferences may be constructed. We may not know or understand our own preferences about something until faced with that choice. To analyse the use of default provisions, the study used the context of time-varying electricity pricing. This is a residential electricity plan which charges significantly lower rates during off-peak use, allowing consumers to voluntarily adjust the time of day they consume electricity and reduce their energy expenses. With aging power sector infrastructure, as well as a myriad of other challenges, policymakers are looking to increase consumer acceptance of these electricity pricing plans to ease peak consumption levels and spread usage more evenly. Fowley et al. Can use the data on electricity consumption as well as the experimental variation in the pricing program default to analyse the effects on participation as well as the follow-on behaviour for different consumer types. The use of electricity plans to analyse consumer behaviour is clever, as to find the changes in behaviour you have a clear measurement in levels of electricity usage and energy expenditure during the experiment as well as prior. This paper approaches increasing participation in time variance pricing by analysis based on a field experiment conducted by the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, or SMUD. In 2011 to 2013, the experiment sought to identify and compare the usage patterns of two consumer sets, these sets being set 1, consumers invited to opt in to the new time-based pricing structure, and set 2, customers who were advised that they would be defaulted into a new time-based pricing structure with an option to opt out. Fowley et al. Exposed the default effect by showing that over 90% of customers stay with the time-based pricing when defaulted onto it. This contrasts with approximately 20% who actively opted in. Clearly, this is a significant variation. However, it is argued that the economic importance of this effect depends on the response by those affected by the default effect. It depends if those defaulted onto the pricing plan reduce their peak consumption in response to time-varying prices. There is no benefit to defaulting them onto the pricing plan if they do not amend their consumption levels in response. This is what we mean by the follow-on effects. We should expect to see a rational consumer amend their consumption levels on pricing program or to opt out of the pricing program to maximize their own utility. As previously mentioned, the paper puts more emphasis on the follow-on effects of a default decision than previous papers. This is important as when examining rational behaviour, we should expect a reaction to varied prices throughout the day. We should expect rational decision makers who decide to opt in or continue with the default to adapt their behaviour to maximise their utility. This follow-on behaviour should be observable in a reduction of peak consumption. Experimental design. Currently, 95% of US residential consumers pay time-invariant prices for electricity. This means that the cost per hour of electricity is not dependent on the time of day. This means that most US consumers are not exposed to prices that reflect the variable marginal operating costs, as time-invariant prices do not reflect the marginal costs either. This leads to overuse in periods of high marginal cost and underuse in periods of low marginal cost. This has led to an overinvestment in capacity to meet excessive peak demand, and time-varying pricing can help alleviate the demand pressure and mitigate the inefficient use of electricity during the peak periods. Experiment methodology. When selecting the test sample for the paper, SMUD drew from its population of residential customers. Households were excluded if they did not meet certain criteria, including if their smart meter had not provided a year's worth of data by the start time of the study. This was to allow SMUD and subsequently Fowler et al. To compare changes in consumption of the default choice and prior to the experiment. Despite the exclusions, 174,000 households remained eligible for the experimental population, and according to SMUD, reported no statistically significant differences between the study sample and the larger customer base. This is an assumption on our part as well as Fowler et al.'s, as there is no data provided to prove this. The experimental population was split into 10 groups, of which only 5 are the focus of the paper that we are critiquing. Of those 5, 4 were encouraged to participate in the new pricing program, as the 5th served as a control group with no encouragement used. There were 2 pricing treatments, time of use, and a critical peak pricing program. There were also 2 forms of encouragement: opt-in, where households were encouraged to enroll in the rate program, and opt-out, where households were notified they were enrolled by default but had the opportunity to leave the program if they so wished. Each pricing treatment, each having 1 group of each form of encouragement. Further information was provided to the groups through technology that tracked real-time consumption and price. This was likely an attempt to minimize the impact of inattentiveness by the decision makers. The data collected from the experiment consisted of 3 key categories of data: household specific data, electrical consumption data, and weather data. Household data included the dates of enrollment and disenrollment from the experiment, amongst other measurements. Electrical consumption, as you would expect, measured the electrical usage of the households as well as their associated expenditure. And due to the proximity to the same weather station, weather did not vary across households, only time. Household consumption was found by SMUD to closely match that of the US households in general. Methodology. Briefly, we will examine the equations used by Fowler et al. To conduct their analysis. The equation that you see on the slide served as the baseline estimating equation for identifying the average intent to treat effect, or the ITT, where YIT measures the hourly electrical consumption for a household, I in hour T, and ZIT is an indicator variable equal to the one starting on June the 1st, 2012, if the household I was encouraged to be in the treatment group, and 0 otherwise. Gamma I is a household fixed effect that captures systematic differences in consumption across households, and tau T, is an hour of sample fixed effect. The coefficient of interest is beta IT, T, which captures the average difference in hourly electricity consumption across treated and control groups, controlling for any pre-treatment differences by group.
Moving on to the results of the experiment, we find that, as expected, there was significant evidence for the existence of the default effect. Specifically, for both the time of use and critical peak pricing programs, only 20% of those assigned to an opt-out by default group chose to opt in to these new programs, leaving 80% on the old program. On the other hand, less than 5% of those who were opted into the new programs by default chose to then opt out and remain on the old program, leaving over 95% in the new. Therefore, by making the new programs the default option, around 75% more of the population participated in these programs than would have otherwise. And when the old program was the default, most participants simply remained on it, seemingly perfectly demonstrating the existence of a default effect. Of course, these results only include first choices by participants. What if participants later change their minds? This is a fair question. However, the ability to choose a different option at a later date was limited. The only participants who could change their mind were those who had opted in either by default or by choice. These participants could choose to revert back to the old program at any point, and less than 10% chose to do this. This means that we only have a reasonably small sample of participants who changed their choice, and thus it is harder to make statistically significant assertions about this group. However, the very fact that such a small percentage of overall participants chose to change their choice means that the overall picture of the results found from the initial choices does not change. In other words, there is not much evidence of subsequent reoptimization. Thus, the default effect significance is not diminished, although it would have been interesting to see the behavior of those who changed their mind expanded upon further in the paper rather than being dismissed as insignificant. Results of this experiment were not unexpected. As we've said before, default effect significance has been well established in multiple experiments already. More interestingly, when considering the results of this paper, is what behaviors were noted subsequently to the participants having made their final decision to opt in, opt out, or follow the default. These are referred to by the authors as follow-on effects, and the authors are the first to look at such effects in detail. The first major follow-on effect noted by the authors is the fact that energy consumption fell on average for all intent-to-treat groups other than the control. Intent-to-treat simply meaning that we analyse all participants in the context of the group they were placed in originally. For example, all participants who were invited to opt in to a critical peak pricing programme are one group. Now, rather expectedly, groups in which opting into the new pricing programmes was the default option. So a greater decrease in average energy consumption by the participants because fewer remained on the old program that did not discourage peak time consumption. This difference is driven by complacents, those that stay with the default option, as the participants who would opt in regardless naturally reduce their consumption in all groups. Complacents, on the other hand, only reduce their consumption when they are placed in the new programs by default. Interestingly, and somewhat aside from the default effect, in the critical peak pricing programs, off-peak consumption fell despite the price of this consumption being lower than in the old program, apparently contravening any traditional price-demand relationship. The authors largely attribute this to newly learned behaviours from the now more expensive on-peak periods, such as learning to turn off lights when leaving rooms. So the point I expressed previously about complacents making up the bulk of the difference between opt-in and opt-out groups in terms of overall average energy consumption is true. However, there was also a significant difference in consumption between those that chose to opt in when this option was not the default, the always opt-iners, and those who were opted in by default, the complacent opt-iners. Participants that would always opt in decreased their energy consumption by far more than the complacents, a difference of 644 watts per hour. This suggests that while having opt-in as the default option will naturally lead to more opt-ins and thus lower average consumption, those that were motivated to choose to opt-in will also be motivated to decrease their individual consumption by far more than those who are simply complacent. Indeed, the study found that always opt-iners consumed 2.5 times less energy than complacents during peak hours in critical peak pricing schemes. The default effect will not suddenly make someone more environmentally conscious or more worried about their bills. On the subject of bills, another follow-on effect considered in the paper is the cost effectiveness of different defaults. One of the major selling points of opting into the new pricing programs for customers is the potential to save money. This ties into the lower energy consumption we've discussed already. Those who specifically chose to opt into critical peak pricing lowered their consumption more and saved around 5% of their bills. Those who were defaulted onto it lowered consumption less and saved just under 4%. On another note, both new pricing programs are planned to be cost-effective, reflected by the electricity companies, lower production costs outweigh the administrative costs associated with those programs. Finally, the authors of the paper use these follow-on effects and their initial results to try and offer some new insights into why the default effect works. To start with, they tackle the idea that the default effect arises because the utility cost of switching away from the default option outweighs the utility gain from the non-default option. For example, the utility cost of researching, worrying that the new prices outweighs the utility cost of simply continuing to pay more for your bills, and individuals would be aware of these costs. The authors did find that the results were generally consistent with what we expected of the impact of such switching costs. However, there was a significant minority of participants who left their default option, even when their monetary gains for doing so were very minor, and thus were likely to result in a net utility or welfare loss. These participants were seemingly acting irrationally. This suggests that switching costs are not solely responsible for the default effect. Indeed, the authors also found that those who would gain simply from being on the new plan without any need for modifying their behaviours whatsoever were no more likely to end up on these new plans than any other group, suggesting that participants are not basing their decisions purely on cost-benefit utility calculations. To rectify this, the authors provide some alternate explanations, and when taken alongside the idea of switching costs, may explain the default effect more fully. For example, I mentioned that a possible switching cost is the utility cost incurred when you have to research your options. The authors argue that this cost might result in rational inattention. This is when participants decide the cost of doing this research is too high, to base their decision on imperfect information. The authors suggest this partly explains the default effect, as participants with a default do not feel the need to research other options, as staying on the default incurs no immediate cost. As a result, they do not possess the information telling them that, say, the time of use scheme is a better option. For empirical evidence of inattentiveness, the authors found that participants who had logged into their online energy account more often in the past were more likely to actively switch from the default, showing that those who were generally less attentive in the past were more likely to stick with the default option. Another explanation is that participants are using other heuristics in their decision making. For example, participants may see the existence of a default option as a form of endorsement for that option. The authors also suggest that individuals may have constructed a preference for a certain option outside of welfare consideration, thus making switching costs less important to these individuals. A more simple explanation by authors is that standard procrastination is the way of leading participants on a plan they would prefer not to. Considering one of the main topics of this paper is the focus on follow-on effects, these effects only make up a relatively small portion of the paper's explanation for the default effect. What is included, however, is the fact that the initial change in electricity consumption behaviors for those in the new programs did not remain the same after 2 years. For the always opt-iners, whose consumption greatly decreased during peak hours initially, this relationship became less strong over time. On the other hand, places whose consumption fell by only a small amount during peak times initially, consumed less and less in these peak periods over 2 years. This showed that over time, all participants in the new pricing schemes adapted to them and formed new normal behaviours, narrowing the initial 644 watt per hour curve discussed previously. This helps to demonstrate that participants did not possess perfect knowledge of the potential utility gains from the lower bills they could have on CPP and TUU. Thus, the idea that they were already aware they could save money, but decided to remain on the open switching costs, is further proved to be somewhat inaccurate. To conclude, Family Tal's paper and particularly strong evidence for the existence of a default effect. This is nothing new. The paper does, in a novel way, demonstrate that there are significant differences in follow-on effects between those that would always opt in and those that would replace them. The paper also demonstrates that the default effects cannot solely be explained by switching costs. There are, in fact, a multitude of possible explanations for the effect. If I had one complaint about the paper, it is that more time could have been devoted to the follow-on effects. This is the first paper that takes into proper consideration